What's happening, everybody? Okay, so you're looking at a Ram DT or the 2019 and up Ram 1500s, and you're thinking about which gear to get. Should you get the 321 or the 392? Well, the smart money just says go drive the two and figure it out. But let's go through the numbers and let's break this thing down with actual math and see if we can get an idea for how these vehicles are going to run just by looking at some specific math that we can look at with gear ratios, tire sizes, and things like that. Pretty interesting detail. By the way, speaking of detail, this is going to be heavy math laden. It's probably going to be the sure cure for insomnia, but if this is a topic that interests you, this will be data that might pique your interest. So, let me get this guy out of the way. And let's take a look at this. So first things first, we have to compare the HP70 transmission in the DS or the Classics to the HP75 transmission, which is in the DT or the 2019 and up. First thing you'll notice is gear ratios. Check this out with gear 1, 2, 3 with the HP70. 4.71, 3.14, and 2.10. When you contrast that with the DT's HP75 of 5.0, 320, and 214, you'll pick up pretty quickly that those are more aggressive gear ratios in the transmission. And what that does is it translates to a gearing equivalent change. It's kind of like having just transmission ratios alone, a 3.4 first gear. In other words, the rear gear, if you have a 321 gear, would be equivalent to having a 3.41. And as you can see, 327, 331. Interesting thing, though, take a look at gears 7 and 8. Notice those numbers are smaller. It's because the overdrives are shorter gears, with the HP70 checking in at 7th gear with 0.84 and 0.67 for its 8th gear. Well, if you look down here, 0.82 and 0.64 respectively for the 75. In other words, it's going to tack lower RPM going down the highway at cruise. Something to think about. Now, how does that translate when you're talking tire sizes? Now, here's what I did. The Classic varies wildly in the size of tires that it would come with from the 20-inch wheel and the 17-inch wheel. But the fact of the matter is that every truck that I see going down the road that's a Classic has 20s on it. So I used that tire size. And in this case, that tire has a circumference of 103.6 inches. It actually is the 275/60/20 that comes on the front of the front, that comes on that truck, front and the rear. What I'm doing is I'm using the 100.77 inch circumference wheel because it's the closest in size. This difference is not that great, by the way, at the tire height adjustment because there's not that big of a difference in tire size with the 18-inch wheel and the 20-inch wheel respectively. So we'll just kind of edge this and try to use a little bit taller tire that comes standard on the newer truck. And when you do that, you'll find that with the tire size adjusted, which tire size does affect final gearing, 3.5 becomes your effective gear ratio if you're comparing it to an HP70 equipped truck with the stock tires on 20-inch wheels. And again, you can see how that plays out here. 336 basically all the way down, or in essence, it is more aggressively geared, and with the tire size affecting final drive ratio, it's even more aggressive still, meaning that that 321 geared truck is going to be snappier. Now, let's take then what the HP70 equipped vehicle would have. Let's take a look at a couple of things over here just so we can get an idea of what that translates to. In purple here, you'll see top speed per gear. 392 gear, and the 321 up here for our, let me switch this over to 321 real quick. So you can see not a huge difference really, but there is still some difference from one to the next. That's going to be important when we start looking at downshifts. That's going to be down here with the downshift info, right down here. But just wanted to show you guys that, and also to show you one other thing. The DT is lighter. by a couple of £100 depending on which vehicle that you're looking at. In this case, I was comparing it to a tradesman, in fact, my own tradesman, that with me in the truck with a very full tank of gas weighs 5,500 pounds. The vehicle weight for the DT should be about 200 pounds. Some will argue more, but I'm just going to use 200 pounds for easy math. 200 pounds lighter for the DT, making that 5,300 pounds. What does that translate to? Well, translates to a torque per pound of 1.10 to 1.24. And again, these are corrected with tire size and everything else, but it's just basically this equation here is how many pounds of torque, which would be right over here, raw torque, or in this case, corrected torque, because we have to correct down, remember, for the tire size being taller for that HP 70. It's the actual amount of engine torque multiplied by your total multiplier, which is your gear multiplied by your transmission ratio. So in other words, blah, 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 all that really translates to is at the actual axle, when you take the tire size into account, you've got a significantly higher torque to the ground. The actual force at the ground is higher with the DT than it is with the DS. In other words, it's better with the newer truck than it is with the older truck, especially when you take weight into consideration. So again, there's a lot of data here to go over. There's a lot of this that's just data for my own benefit. Here's some things I wanted to show you that you might find a little bit curious. So let's go over here. Let's say, and just kind of give you an idea for driving, like a driving experience. Let's change this to 3.09. Notice everything changed. Let's change this tire size. Let's say it's, a stock Hellcat front. Let's change that tire size to a car tire size. And now let's take a look at that weight. And let's make this thing weigh about as much as like a RT Challenger. So with driver, that'd be about 4,400 pounds. Right in that ballpark. We're going to get to that torque to weight thing here in just a second, but take a look at this. And did you guys notice this? Top speed per gear, first gear, it's practically the same. Second gear, what? Third gear? That's going to come into play just as a driving experience, primarily with partial throttle downshifts. The truck will tack roughly the same as your Scat Pack shaker, your RT shaker with a 309 gear, for example, your Hellcat, another one. It will have the same sound, if you will. It's going to be going through the gears at about the same rate, at least given a certain acceleration rate. I think you guys know what I mean by that. But just something interesting, kind of a coincidence. Now, let's take another look at something. Torque per pound, obviously higher is going to be better. So this thing is going to accelerate. This, the car is going to accelerate harder than our 1.24. So we get that. But let's try something. Here's another little coincidence, or is it a coincidence? Let's go with that optional 3.92 gear. Now, you'll notice that our top speed per gear just absolutely tanked. Should make sense. It's nowhere near the same. But did anybody pick up on something? Come over here to the torque per pound. It is now practically identical. In fact, it is identical in first gear, 1.52, 0.097, 0.65. Wait a minute, this is getting eerily the same. In essence, with a 392 gear, it's going to feel more or less like an RT Challenger. It's just that it's going to be shifting a lot quicker and it's obviously heavier. It also means that it's going to break the tires loose like an RT Challenger. It's just not going to have the wheel speed to go along with it. So figured I would bring that to you guys. I thought you might find that a little bit interesting. Now let's get into the downshift info and talk about how the driving experience is going to change between the different gears with the DT that you think you might be looking to pick up. So we've talked about the difference between the DT and the DS. The DT on paper at least should be significantly quicker with the 321, but should you go with the 321 over the 392? Oh, well, you might say yes and you might say no. Let's take a look at just a driving experience. Now, here's one thing I can't give you guys. I can't give you quarter mile experience or anything like that, but we've already found that the 321 is already significantly more aggressively geared if you're going street tire for street tire. And I'm going to keep this based on street tires because if you're taking your truck to the drag strip, you already know how this does and doesn't apply to you. But for most guys on the street that are doing street stuff with their trucks, this is how that 321 is going to compare to the 392. So let's dig into it. We've talked about top speeds per gear, and this would basically be your shift point when you are running at wide open throttle, with a shift point, if you notice down here, at 5,500 RPM. So, taking all that into account, we have to come up with some kind of a metric that we can use to actually, score the driving experience. So what I did is I took some mile per hour for downshifts and I color coded. This is all HP 70. Really, this doesn't really apply for us, but we'll get back to that if we need to. But I don't think we do because we're looking at HP 75 right now. 321 versus 392. This 355 was, well, it's unfortunate that they're not going to be offering that 355. So let's just get rid of that little 355. And we're going to get rid of this one too, just because I don't want it clouding up what we're looking at. All right, so what does this little chart mean right here that I'm looking at? Well, let me tell you what it means. It's a downshift performance score. It's a little bit objective and a little bit subjective. Let me get into this and explain to you what I mean. For each mile an hour that we're looking at, in this case 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, etc., it's at that speed that if you went wide open throttle, it would downshift into, in this case, 3.21 downshifts into first. 392 has to downshift into second. And because of the different gear ratios, one is going to feel more or less perky. It's going to accelerate harder. So in this case, green and blue would signify hard acceleration. White would be kind of right there in the middle, kind of falls within the middle of the gear. Orange is going to fall really far down in the gear. In other words, it's going to fall further down into a gear to where it takes it longer to accelerate through that gear. And yellow is the worst case scenario. Yellow is a speed that is within just a 1 or 2 percentage points of either the very lowest portion of the gear that it would drop down into, or if it did try to drop down 2 gears, it would only be in that gear for that amount of time. So with all those qualifiers out of the way, let's take a look. Well, 25 miles an hour, 321, it's going to be pretty lively at that point because it's got a top speed in that gear of 32 miles per hour. But at 30 miles an hour, it's basically right there. It's the worst possible scenario because you're at 32 miles per hour max. If it did go into first gear, it'd be whap, and then it would immediately shift, and you're right down in the worst part, right into the lowest portion of your next gear. And so on, and that's how this plays through. So what I did is I just took how many greens are there, and I gave that a number. How many yellows are there? Worst case scenario. Gave that a number. The orange, in some transmission tuners speak, we call these doldrums. It's just kind of a flat spot where you hit it and it's going too fast to downshift to a gear that it would really be lively in, but it's not going fast enough to really downshift into a hyper part of the gear that it's in, so it's just a bit of a doldrum. Number of those. The worst case scenarios, the blue, which is kind of a cool spot, but not quite a green. And I had to give them a total. And what it looked like is this. Green plus blue, the two good ones, minus either the boring ones or the ones that were going to be bad, orange, yellow, and white. And I gave them a total. Basically, the higher the number, the better. And in this case, 321 had 5 green, 1 blue, 3 orange, 4 yellow, and 0 whites, which I found really curious. If I wouldn't, I'm trying to do this as objectively as I can, and I found that portion of this score to be kind of weird. Anyway, came out to -1. The 392 gear, and again, this is highway and city and everything else combined because I took this scale all the way down to 25, had 3 areas where it was really strong on the downshift. 0 blues, though. I found that to be kind of strange. 4 doldrums, the highest of the group, and 4 worst case scenarios. And again, this mysteriously absent 355 gear would have actually scored pretty good as well. Anyway, getting back to it, when you look at how the greens and the blues, if you will, and in this case there was really only 1 for the 321 fall into place, and again no blues for the 392, you'll find that the 321 is actually a little bit more of a versatile gear. But if you look at this, it'll also kind of give you the idea that it could be a little bit more of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type of a gear. Because if on a partial downshift, if it just downshifts 1 gear, it always seems like it's got a second gear to come down into at wide open throttle that's going to be really sharp when it hits that downshift. The 392 doesn't really have that, and that does play itself out on the test drive should you get the chance to do so. So one area that you might be asking yourself is, well, why didn't you bother going any lower than 25 miles an hour, say 20 miles an hour, where that 392, if you look down here at the top speed for that gear, let me change this to 392 so it's not confusing. And actually, don't worry about this stuff right here, because that's when I was doing the 355 stuff. I was actually trying to make this a little bit more in-depth, and it ended up getting real convoluted. Anyway, why wouldn't you want to include 20 miles per hour? The reason why I didn't want to include 20 miles an hour in this is because I'm doing this from a practical point of view. If you go wide open throttle with a 392 first gear and it drops, or with a 392 and it drops down into first gear, it is going to spin the tires, which is, everybody just loves that, but it's going to spin the tires, but more importantly, it's going to spin the tires and it's going to command an early shift. Even with traction control off, and if you've got a 4-wheel drive truck, you can actually turn it all the way off, but chances are, if you're in a traffic situation, you might just watt the throttle and it's going to spin the tires if it downshifts like that. It's just not a practical spot for the gear itself. Now, if I did include that, basically this number right here, the 3, would go to 4 for the score, giving it -6 instead of a -7. Even if this thing had another doldrum, or even if it were yellow, that score would still be like a -2 to -6. It wouldn't be enough to really be a game changer. And besides, let me tell you something. You go watt with a 321 gear under 20 miles an hour, and it's going to, or at or below 20, it's going to be hazing the tires too. It will just not haze them so hard that it commands a quicker upshift. So in that case, the 321 has the nod as well. Now, what I can't show you is the partial throttle downshift feel with these. But remember when I was showing you the differences, or the similarities, I should say, with a 321 gear and the speed that it had in gear versus a 309 geared car, in essence, with a car tire size. And I used the Scat Pack RT, or rather a Scat Pack or RT in that comparison. Let me tell you this, the 321, when you're driving it, let's say you're cruising along and you just tip into the throttle enough to command a partial throttle downshift, just 1 gear. When the 321 downshifts, it feels like the truck is catching up with the gear. The amount of throttle input that you're giving it is commensurate to a higher mile per hour in the lower gear. So it'll just kind of advance when you tip into the throttle that way. The 392 gear, the way that it feels is a little bit different. When you tip into the throttle and you command that one gear downshift, the amount of throttle that you're giving it is about what it needs to go that fast at that one lower speed or at that one lower gear. The speed that you're going, given the amount of throttle input, is about what it would need to just maintain that speed. So you find yourself tipping into the throttle a little bit more. And psychologically, it almost makes the truck feel like it's struggling. So with a 392, it's like the gear is trying to catch up with the truck as opposed to the truck advancing and catching the gear. Now you tip further into the throttle with a 392 and you get a downshift, a hard downshift. Basically, that would be your passing gear. Well, the thing is a lot of times, and if you look at this and you're cruising down the highway, 60, 65, 75 miles an hour, you're going to be in the worst possible scenario for the 392 when you're in the absolute best possible scenario for the 321. So the high-speed downshift is favoring the 321 because when it downshifts into third gear instead of fourth gear for the 392. And even though this is green, that fourth gear can only carry out to 77 miles per hour, where fourth gear will carry to 95 miles per hour in the 321. But both of them having roughly the same mile per hour in third gear, 321 versus the 392. So what does that mean? Well, you're downshifting with a 321 into a gear that has 6.87 to 1 ratio versus 6.74 when you go wide open and it drops down into that gear. In other words, the 321 is actually a more aggressive gear on the highway when you go to a wide open throttle downshift. And again, that 392 gear going down the highway, you'll notice it feels like the truck or the gear is trying to catch up to the truck, so to speak, as opposed to the truck advancing to the speed that throttle position would allow for it going down the highway. And I know I gave you guys a ton of information on this, and it's a lot to take in, but I wanted to do something a little bit different. You know, on the forum, you always see 321 versus 392. Which is better? Which one should I get? Well, I broke it down for you the best way I know how with an Excel spreadsheet and a whole bunch of numbers. I'm hoping this helped you out. Again, I can walk you guys back over here so you can get an idea for what it was that I was talking about. Let me put the truck information back in here. So if you need to stop and take a look, you can. So let me do that. Oh, hang on. Pretty neat comparison with the cars, by the way. I always thought that was neat. So anyway, here you guys go. Again, I hope this helps you out in making your pick. I will say this. If you are choosing, here's the circumferences, diameters of various tires. Pause the video and take a look at that. That's just some ratios from different transmissions that I was keeping around just as a reference. Anyway, I hope that helps you out. And post up your comments. Let me know what you think. I was going to say this, and I am going to say this rather. If you are planning on putting larger tires on your truck, just get the 392s. You're going to want them. Especially if you're looking at putting something on there like a 35 inch, something that's, got a circumference of 110 inches or greater, absolutely go with that. Absolutely go with the 392s. You're going to need it just to get the heavy weight of the wheel and tire combination moving. That 321 is not going to do you a whole lot of good. But if you're planning on sticking around the stock tire height, then that 321, it's really tough to beat. And with the new ratios, when you compare it to the old truck with the stock tire size on that truck, it's pretty impressive. Drive them both, though. That's the only way you'll really know how. With that, that's a wrap. Adios.